Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a deliberate exercise in the total integration of human consciousness within a perpetual, data-driven cycle of conflict. The consensus often reduces the film to a fragmented expansion of the stand-alone complex timeline, viewed primarily through the aesthetic lens of its transitioned animation style. This perspective, however, overlooks the film's central assertion that in an era defined by a sustainable war, the boundary between the individual self and the state-sponsored digital infrastructure has effectively dissolved. The film presents a reality where war is not a disruption of the economy, but its primary engine, and human identity is a series of variables managed by algorithms designed to keep the conflict stable, predictable, and endless. The world of sustainable war is built upon the systemic commodification of strife. By institutionalizing conflict, the global powers ensure a constant demand for cybernetic labor and informational warfare. The architecture of this reality reflects this hierarchy. The high-tech, sterile environments of international agencies exist in stark contrast to the decaying, subterranean zones where scavenged hardware is the only means of survival. This environment dictates the behavior of Section 9, whose members exist as ghosts within a machine they no longer control, but rather calibrate. Major Motoko Kusanagi and her team are no longer simply investigators, they are active components in a feedback loop where their tactical successes provide the very data required to refine the global sustainable war algorithm. Character psychology in this iteration of the franchise is defined by an epistemic fracture. The protagonists operate with a profound awareness of their own synthetic nature, moving past the classic existential question of what is a soul to the more immediate concern of what is an objective action. The film uses the visual language of CGI to amplify this, rendering characters with a clinical, high-fidelity precision that underscores their status as digital assets. Their interactions, often punctuated by silence and technical, jargon-heavy discourse, reveal a profound lack of traditional human intimacy. They are traumatized not by a singular event, but by the repetitive, automated nature of their own existence, performing their roles in a theater of war they are fully aware is a scripted, mathematical necessity. The philosophical underpinnings of the work are grounded in the realization that rebellion is itself a function of the system. The narrative treats the concept of a grand, heroic struggle as a vestigial impulse, replaced by an absurdist acceptance of the loop. When Section 9 maneuvers through their missions, they do so with a cold efficiency that mirrors the enemy they hunt. The film argues that morality in this post-human landscape is an obsolete metric. What matters is the optimization of the system's constraints. Any attempt by the characters to assert individual agency is quickly reabsorbed by the global network, which uses their actions to calculate the next cycle of the war. This is a universe where the individual has become a peripheral component in a massive, self-correcting machine. Technically, the film utilizes its visual execution to reflect this loss of agency. The cinematography relies on wide, sweeping digital vistas and smooth, unnatural camera movements that lack the organic tremor of human observation. This stylistic choice effectively alienates the audience, forcing a perspective that feels as synthetic and calculated as the world depicted on screen. The CGI, with its specific textures and global lighting, creates an environment that feels perpetually rendered, further emphasizing that the characters are inhabitants of a simulation that has already replaced the physical world. The sonic landscape, characterized by rhythmic, sterile electronic pulses, reinforces this feeling of a world governed by code rather than conscience. Ultimately, sustainable war serves as a reflection of a society that has surrendered its future to the comfort of algorithmic stability. It captures the modern anxiety regarding the loss of a coherent, singular history in an age where information is infinite and context is discarded. The film does not offer an escape from this cycle because, within its framework, the struggle to remain an individual is exactly what feeds the machine. By the final frame, the characters have not solved the conflict, they have merely successfully integrated into the next phase of its maintenance. The film posits that the final stage of technological evolution is not the emergence of a superintelligence, but the total surrender of humanity to a state of perpetual, sustainable irrelevance, where the act of living is simply another data point in a war that can never be won because it is never intended to end. The subversion question. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a deliberate interrogation of the post-human myth, positing that the evolution toward a digital existence is not a transcendence of biology, but an expansion of late-stage capitalist extraction. While popular discourse often frames the franchise as a meditation on the soul's residency within the machine, Sustainable War shifts the lens to demonstrate that the soul is merely the ultimate intellectual property, and the sustainable war of the title is the primary economic engine required to keep the global simulation running. The film argues that systemic instability is not a byproduct of conflict, but the product itself, engineered to prevent the collapse of an information-based economy that relies on constant, manufactured crisis to maintain its market value. The world of SAC 2045 is defined by a global sustainable war where international powers maintain a perpetual state of controlled conflict to stimulate economic growth. This is not a failure of diplomacy but a triumphant, terrifying efficiency of global governance. The architecture reflects this by erasing the boundary between the battlefield and the marketplace. Urban spaces are not static environments but shifting, data-rich transit zones where citizens are perpetually monitored as both consumers and combatants. The visual geography, dominated by sterile, high-definition digital rendering, emphasizes that the environment is fundamentally artificial. By using a distinct, high-fidelity CGI aesthetic, the film visually manifests the hyperreality of its setting. The artificiality of the visual style acts as a diegetic confirmation of the world's nature, a place where physical space has been entirely replaced by digital utility. At the core of the human element lies the protagonist, Motoko Kusanagi, who functions less as a hero of liberation and more as a highly skilled technician of this specific, brutal order. Her trauma is not found in the loss of her humanity, but in her role as a primary enforcement mechanism for the very system she supposedly resists. The film presents the psyche as a series of modular upgrades and software patches. Kusanagi's detachment is not a symptom of her cyberization, it is the logical outcome of a life spent navigating a reality where identity is fungible. When the film forces her to confront the posthumans, beings who have genuinely transcended the constraints of the system, it reveals her own existential terror. These entities are not just antagonists, they are the mirror image of her potential future. They expose her adherence to the status quo as a defensive, narrow choice rather than an inevitable condition of existence. Philosophically, Sustainable War dismantles the notion of individual agency within an algorithmic society. The characters are trapped in a feedback loop where their tactical decisions contribute to the sustainability of the war they aim to end. The film demonstrates that in an environment where all information is mediated, the concept of a true reality is rendered obsolete. The post-truth state here is not a chaotic accident, it is the foundation of governance. By framing the conflict through the lens of economic sustainability, the film moves beyond standard cybernoir tropes. It aligns with a materialist critique where the ghost in the machine is essentially an asset to be managed, traded, or liquidated. The moral calculus is entirely utilitarian, and the protagonist's refusal to fully engage in the radical transformation offered by the antagonists marks her as a guardian of a dying, broken, yet profitable status quo. Technically, the film utilizes its medium to underscore the erasure of the organic. The high-contrast, sharp-edged aesthetic of the CGI provides a claustrophobic, synthetic texture that prevents the viewer from ever finding a natural anchor point. This is not a flaw of the production but a deliberate choice to force the audience into the same environment the characters inhabit, one where the absence of natural light, dust, or imperfect textures reinforces the feeling of being inside a managed, closed system. The rhythm of the editing, which prioritizes tactical movement and information density, mirrors the rapid, relentless processing of the world's background noise. There is no stillness in this film, because in a world of sustainable, constant warfare, stillness is equivalent to bankruptcy. Ultimately, Sustainable War leaves the viewer with an unsettling synthesis of its thematic parts. The conclusion does not offer a grand liberation or a restoration of the natural order. Instead, it reaffirms the cycle. The protagonist remains a functioning cog, albeit one with a clearer, more terrifying view of the mechanism she serves. The legacy of the film lies in its refusal to romanticize the struggle against the system. It positions the battle for autonomy not as an external war against a villainous entity, but as an internal fight to reclaim the soul from the very economic frameworks that define it. By the final frame, The film posits that the most successful, sustainable result of the narrative is the maintenance of the status quo, leaving the characters and the audience trapped in a cycle of engineered conflict that is far more durable than any human life. The triumph of the film is its ability to present this nihilistic stagnation as the most logical, profitable, and inescapable outcome of a hyper-connected, fully commodified future. The anomaly question. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a deliberate exercise in the friction between digital artifice and the preservation of the human essence. While the film is often framed as a mere condensation of its source series, it operates as a meditation on the permanence of the soul within a recursive, global economic loop. The core thesis is that in a world defined by sustainable war or a planned, perpetual conflict designed to prevent total economic collapse, the individual is not a protagonist but a persistent data set, and the film's specific visual language serves to illustrate the horror of living as an immortal variable in a machine-coded reality. The world of SAC 2045 is defined by a desperate, automated scarcity where the sustainable war acts as a global financial instrument. The economy functions as a closed ecosystem, where the machinery of conflict provides the very stability that prevents total systemic failure. In this environment, human labor is transformed into a secondary concern. The primary commodity is predictive intelligence. The architectural geography of the film reinforces this, utilizing expansive digital environments that dwarf the members of Section 9, underscoring their relative insignificance against the vast, invisible currents of the global market. The production design prioritizes sterile, high-tech transit spaces and weaponized urban zones, creating a visual hierarchy where those who control the information flow operate in an ethereal, synthetic digital plane, while the rest of humanity resides in the rusted, decaying physical remnants of a previous, more chaotic age. At the center of this landscape is Major Motoko Kusanagi, whose existence epitomizes the struggle to define the self within an environment that demands complete integration into the network. Her character psychology is shaped by the relentless need for autonomy in a post-human landscape. The film presents the ghost, the seat of human consciousness, not as an immutable spark, but as a fragile, negotiable entity. As the plot progresses, the epistemic fracture becomes clear. The characters are not merely fighting enemies, but are actively resisting the realization that their own choices are perhaps echoes of an algorithmic design. This creates a powerful somatic experience, where the characters navigate their synthetic bodies with a mixture of practiced precision and underlying existential dread. The shadow of their past exploits looms, acting as a recurring anchor that prevents them from fully dissolving into the hyperreality of the network. The film's philosophical weight rests on the ethics of this sustainable war. By framing conflict as a necessary component of the economy, the directors force a confrontation with a chilling moral calculus. Is it preferable to exist within a stable, simulated oppression, or to fight for an unpredictable, chaotic freedom? The film denies the comfort of a simple, rebellious narrative. Instead, it posits that the individual's fight, no matter how valiant, is often absorbed and moneized by the system they intend to dismantle. This is where the film's technical execution becomes critical. The 3D animation style, often debated for its uncanny stillness, is not a limitation but a tool of storytelling. The characters move with a robotic economy that blurs the line between human agency and program behavior, forcing the viewer to constantly question whether they are witnessing a choice or a subroutine. Technically, the film utilizes lighting and sound to create an atmosphere of clinical isolation. The color palette, dominated by cold, synthetic blues and harsh, industrial grays, strips away the warmth of the natural world, leaving only the cold logic of the digital interface. The integration of CGI ensures that the environments feel dense and immutable, a visual metaphor for the weight of the system the characters inhabit. Sound design plays a similarly vital role. The clinical silence of the network is frequently shattered by the sudden, discordant noise of physical combat, highlighting the disconnect between the two realities the characters straddle. The rhythmic editing keeps the viewer in a state of constant, low-level anxiety, reflecting the instability of a world that is perpetually at war to maintain its own status quo. Ultimately, Sustainable War concludes by affirming that the struggle for meaning is not rendered futile by the scale of the system. Even if the world is a recursive loop designed to commodify conflict, the act of questioning that loop remains the final bastion of human agency. The film does not offer an easy resolution, nor does it suggest that the system can be destroyed through traditional violence. Instead, it suggests that the most radical act is the preservation of one's own ghost against the homogenization of a digital, predictive society. The film's legacy lies in its refusal to offer the viewer a cathartic victory, choosing instead to leave them with the haunting image of individuals who continue to act, to think, and to exist in a reality that would prefer them to be nothing more than static data points. By centering the story on this eternal, unresolved friction, the film cements its position as a stark, provocative vision of a future that has already begun to crystallize in our present. The synthesis question. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a deliberate interrogation of the post-human condition, positing that humanity's reliance on digital interconnectedness inevitably strips the individual of agency, transforming existence into a perpetual, automated loop of conflict. While often viewed as a mere compilation of its serialized predecessor, the film acts as a definitive treatise on the erosion of the self within a sustainable global economy. The film argues that systemic stability, what the narrative terms sustainable war, requires the total commodification of human struggle, wherein the rebellion of the protagonist is not merely a threat to the state, but a necessary fuel for the machine itself. The sociological framework of SAC 2045 is defined by a world where peace is a bankrupt concept, replaced by a permanent state of managed economic stimulation. Conflict has become the primary currency, and the Public Security Section 9 operates as both the maintainer of this order and its most sophisticated victims. The environment is one of architectural sprawl and technological saturation, where the distinction between the physical landscape and the virtual net has fully evaporated. This lack of clear boundaries mirrors the internal state of Major Motoko Kusanagi and her team, who navigate a reality where their memories and tactical decisions are mediated by layers of obfuscated data. The film's visual language, characterized by a distinct 3D aesthetic, reinforces this. The characters exist in a space that feels simultaneously synthetic and visceral, underscoring the instability of their digital ghosts within their cybernetic shells. Psychologically, the film delves into the trauma of the post-human subject. Kusanagi and her colleagues, particularly Batu, struggle with the realization that their sense of individuality is an interface design, a user experience managed by corporate and geopolitical entities. Their core wound is the loss of an authentic past, replaced by the requirement to perform their duties within a feedback loop. This repetition compulsion is not a character flaw, but a survival mechanism. When the facade drops, the film reveals characters who are fundamentally adrift, possessing the power to reshape the physical world while lacking the interiority to define their own desires. The antagonist, the post-human entity, serves as the mirror to this existential void, representing an evolution that has bypassed human morality entirely in favor of sheer computational efficiency. Philosophically, sustainable war engages with the collapse of the grand narrative. In a world where the state and corporate power are indistinguishable, the traditional humanistic pursuit of truth is rendered obsolete by the sheer volume of controlled information. The film positions itself within the territory of Baudrillard's hyperreality, where the simulated conflict of the sustainable war has become more real and more profitable than any potential period of actual peace. The moral calculus presented is not one of right versus wrong, but of participation versus obsolescence. The character's struggle is that of an absurd revolt. They fight against a system that has already anticipated their resistance and integrated it into its own operational logic. Technically, the film utilizes its visual execution to serve this thesis of systemic entrapment. The integration of 3D character models with complex digital environments creates a sense of profound, sterile isolation. Unlike the hand-drawn, tactile grit of previous installments, the digital precision of SAC 2045 highlights the artificiality of the protagonist's world. The camera acts as an objective, sometimes cold observer, capturing the characters not as heroic agents, but as assets moving through a highly controlled simulation. The score and sound design further alienate the viewer, blending diegetic industrial noise with non-diegetic electronic tones that blur the lines between the physical world and the digital net. These technical choices reflect the internal state of the characters. They are subjects rendered and processed by the system they inhabit. Ultimately, Sustainable War concludes that the struggle for autonomy in a hyper-connected, late-capitalist society is a Sisyphean endeavor. The synthesis of its psychology, sociology, and philosophy reveals a bleak, yet resonant conclusion. In a world where conflict is the only sustainable resource, the act of rebellion is merely another form of labor. The film leaves the audience with the understanding that the ghost, the seat of human consciousness, is not a static identity but a fleeting spark that exists only in the friction between the individual and their totalizing environment. The legacy of this work lies in its unflinching depiction of a future where the human shell has been repurposed into a cog within a perpetual war machine, and the struggle to remain an individual is the only meaningful act left. The film does not offer the comfort of resolution. Instead, it demands that the viewer recognize the cycle of their own participation in the systems they inhabit. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. In Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War, the global economy has metastasized into a state of perpetual, managed conflict known as sustainable war. The fundamental currency of this reality is the mobilization of violence itself, where the act of warfare functions as a continuous economic stimulus package for a global system hovering on the brink of collapse. This monopoly on resource allocation is visualized through the sleek, sterile interfaces of the Ghost network and the omnipresent data streams that dictate the movements of the elite. Power is no longer located in the control of physical land or traditional factories, it is concentrated in the hands of those who curate the algorithms of conflict, ensuring that the wheels of commerce continue to turn through the precise application of geopolitical friction. The shadow economy flourishes in the gaps left by this regulated devastation. In the black markets of the 2045 landscape, the most illicit goods are high-fidelity data packets and legacy software capable of bypassing the ubiquitous surveillance of the sustainable war grid. These subterranean exchanges reveal a society starved for autonomy. Citizens trade in ghost hacks and unmonitored digital identities, revealing the profound repression of individual agency in a world where even one's presence on the net is a tracked commodity. This scarcity of private information underscores the desperation of a populace forced to navigate an existence where anonymity is the most valuable and dangerous contraband one can possess. Labor in this era is entirely defined by the post-human condition. The value of an individual is tied directly to their ability to interface with the machine state. Intelligence and consciousness have become the primary assets, stripped of their organic baggage and treated as upgradable modules. Bodies are temporary, modular housings that fluctuate in value based on their combat utility or processing speed. Consequently, labor is commodified into a series of task-specific cycles, where even the elite Section 9 team finds their human experiences, memories, interpersonal bonds, and physical sensation subjugated to the cold, strategic requirements of their digital functions. The human element survives only as a vestigial component of a much larger, automated industrial process. Technological gatekeeping defines the social hierarchy, creating a jagged divide between those who can afford the cutting-edge cybernetic integration and the vast underclass stuck with scavenged or obsolete hardware. The elite inhabit a world of frictionless, high-speed connectivity, where their neural interfaces are seamlessly integrated into the global economic engine. Conversely, the masses navigate the physical world using degraded, glitch-prone prosthetics, effectively locking them out of the high-level decision-making processes that dictate their survival. This disparity is not merely a wealth gap, it is an ontological divide that determines who has the processing power to exist as a conscious entity and who is forced to operate as a peripheral, disposable object. A normal Tuesday in this world is defined by a chilling, manufactured stability. For the civilian, the baseline is a life of highly mediated comfort, where the pervasive dread of total systemic collapse is kept at bay by the constant, low-level hum of the propaganda engine. This reality is meticulously maintained to prevent the public from realizing that their prosperity is built upon the literal, kinetic destruction of distant nations. By establishing this facade of normalcy, the film highlights the sheer fragility of the societal order. The inciting incidents that fracture this calm are not mere anomalies but inevitable ruptures caused by the accumulation of a system that treats reality as a luxury commodity. When the facade inevitably cracks, it reveals that for the average citizen, existence is a performance of compliance, held together by the thin, fragile threads of a simulated peace that benefits only the architects of the war. Architecture and the visual geography. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War presents a vision of the future defined by a pervasive, planetary-scale economic engine, that sustainable war, which functions as a perpetual motion machine of destruction and reconstruction. The film posits that in an era where global conflict serves as the primary driver for capital circulation, the landscape itself is the most legible indicator of systemic control. The world building in Sustainable War utilizes architectural hierarchy and visual geography to illustrate a society that has transitioned from the messy, organic chaos of the late 20th century into a highly curated, synthetic cycle of managed collapse. The architectural hierarchy in this reality is a rigid, vertical stratification that maps directly onto the value of human and post-human agency. The elite and their corporate manifestations inhabit spaces defined by minimalist, sterile geometry, frictionless, high-altitude environments where the digital and physical interfaces are seamless. These locations act as nodes of pure data exchange, untouched by the entropy of the ground-level reality. In contrast, the civilian populace occupies the interstitial spaces of the infrastructure, living within the repurposed, cluttered remnants of the previous economic order. The production design emphasizes this disparity through density. While the powerful exist in expansive, light-filled voids, the disenfranchised are compressed into hyperdense urban corridors that feel like subterranean conduits for the flow of human labor. The tension between the synthetic and the organic serves as the defining visual language of the film. Remnants of the natural world exist only as nostalgic artifacts or strictly contained aesthetic features within corporate zones, rendered with a calculated, lifeless precision. The rest of the world, however, is characterized by a state of chronic, deliberate disrepair. The cities are not merely aging, they are being curated to look like rusted-out ruins to satisfy the requirements of the Sustainable War. Buildings are maintained in a state of suspended decay, a visual aesthetic that serves as a performance of crisis for the international markets. This allows the film to showcase a world that is effectively a global soundstage where architecture is treated as a consumable resource, stripped of its permanence and repurposed as a static prop for a never-ending economic drama. The geography of navigation further reinforces the isolation of the individual within this system. The camera frequently captures the protagonists as they move through vast, sprawling slums that feel less like neighborhoods and more like circulatory systems for the flow of goods and data. The wide shots, achieved through dense CGI set extensions, serve a specific function. They diminish the individual, rendering Section 9 members and civilians alike as tiny, inconsequential vectors within a massive, procedural machine. The visual scale conveys the overwhelming weight of the systemic design, suggesting that any act of personal rebellion is statistically minimized by the sheer, cold geometry of the urban environment. The VFX of scale in Sustainable War is not merely an exercise in world building, but a direct argument about the nature of power in a post-human society. The world is built to discourage internal movement and promote reliance on the digital networks that define the era. By presenting the physical world as a collection of modular, replaceable sectors, the film captures the essence of a civilization that has commodified its own survival. The environment is designed to be experienced through the lens of a controller. The navigation of these spaces feels like navigating a user interface, where the distinction between the physical street and the digital map is rendered irrelevant by the ubiquitous mediation of augmented reality. The result is a geography that feels both infinite and claustrophobic, reflecting a reality where human presence is tethered to the physical surface while consciousness and economic potential are perpetually extracted and processed in the cloud. In Sustainable War, the environment is the ultimate architect of the human experience, forcing every inhabitant into a predetermined trajectory that keeps the engines of conflict spinning, generation after generation. Epistemology, Information, and Society. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a rigorous examination of a world where truth is an industrial byproduct, manufactured and refined with the same clinical efficiency as the weapons that dominate its geopolitical landscape. In this reality, epistemology is entirely mediated by digital networks, rendering objective truth a relic of an analog past. The film asserts that in an era of ubiquitous connectivity, information is not a bridge to enlightenment but a calculated tool for social stabilization. The characters operate within a consensus reality, where what is true is determined by the specific bandwidth of information provided by the state, corporations, and algorithms. This mediation creates an environment where the citizenry exists in a state of perpetual processing, perpetually flooded with high-velocity data points that obscure the underlying architecture of their own subjugation. The ruling power structure maintains order through a sophisticated propaganda engine that disguises systemic exploitation as a global necessity. This sustainable war, a paradox designed to keep the global economy in a state of controlled, permanent agitation, is presented to the public not as a failure of governance, but as the optimal solution for managing scarcity and growth. The film illustrates how this official history functions as a cognitive cage, by framing the constant state of conflict as an inevitable, mathematically sound strategy for peace. The powers that be effectively neutralize dissent. The populace consumes this metanarrative as a survival mechanism, accepting the thin, digital veneer of current events while remaining intentionally blind to the mechanisms of labor and capital that necessitate their ongoing precarity. In this landscape, the distinction between data and knowledge becomes the primary site of conflict. The protagonists of Section 9 navigate a world where they are drowning in noise, yet consistently starved of meaningful context. The film highlights the irony of a hyperconnected society where the sheer volume of available information makes the synthesis of wisdom increasingly difficult. Intelligence gathering, in this context, is not the act of uncovering hidden facts, but the laborious process of filtering out the state-mandated noise to perceive the structural reality of the world. The characters' struggle is defined by their attempts to maintain a kernel of individual sovereignty within an environment that treats consciousness as a network node to be monitored, optimized, and redirected. The architectural and social geography of SAC 2045 further reinforces this epistemic control. The physical world is marked by a stark division between those who operate within the official network and those who have been effectively exiled into the margins. The outgroups, those who exist in the shadows of the digital grid, are not merely geographically displaced, they are epistemologically invisible. By forcing dissenters and the impoverished to exist in the obsolete, crumbling ruins of the pre-network age, the society creates a literal visual representation of its own historical erasure. The film suggests that those who cannot or will not participate in the digital consensus are effectively written out of the societal record, forced to scavenge for remnants of a reality that the central authorities have long since discarded. Ultimately, the film posits that in a technologically advanced society, the most effective form of control is the manipulation of the epistemological field itself. The characters are forced to constantly navigate a reality that is physically simulated and socially engineered, where the senses are frequently secondary to the digital interfaces that dictate perception. The film posits that true agency in this world requires the painful, systematic dismantling of one's own programmed understanding of truth. As the narrative progresses, the characters are forced to reconcile their internal identity with the external, mediated history imposed upon them, revealing that the sustainable war is a cage built not of steel, but of pervasive, state-sanctioned misinformation. By depicting a society that chooses the comfort of a fabricated, stable conflict over the chaos of an objective, unmediated truth, the film presents a chilling portrait of a humanity that has traded the potential for genuine enlightenment for the cold, predictable safety of a managed reality. The tragedy of the characters lies in their ability to see the scenes in the machine, while acknowledging that their struggle for truth may, in itself, be another layer of the very system they seek to dismantle. Friction, Law, and the Catalyst. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a deliberate interrogation of a world trapped within a perpetual, manufactured equilibrium. The film operates on the premise that global order is no longer maintained by traditional governance, but by a sustainable war economy that transmutes political friction into a predictable, manageable financial asset. In this reality, the state has been effectively superseded by algorithmic oversight, where the law serves merely as a baseline protocol for corporate expansion. The world is a closed-loop system defined by its refusal to conclude, ensuring that the currency of conflict remains perpetually liquid, circulating endlessly to sustain the dominance of global entities that benefit from a state of controlled instability. Within this framework, justice is stripped of its moral dimension, evolving into a purely mathematical extraction of value. Retribution is not a restorative act but a recalibration of the system, where offenders are processed based on their threat to the market's stability rather than their moral culpability. This environment creates a rigid architectural and social hierarchy. The elite operate within pristine, digital-gated realities, while the labor force is relegated to the cluttered, decaying remnants of a world that no longer values physical infrastructure. Information is the primary commodity, yet it is so heavily mediated by proprietary interfaces that knowledge is indistinguishable from the propaganda of the ruling algorithmic apparatus. The baseline misery of the populace is a design choice, a necessary tension required to keep the gears of the sustainable war turning, ensuring that the normal Tuesday of a civilian is defined by precarity and digital surveillance. The sociological catalyst for the protagonists is the emergence of the posthuman, a technological anomaly that threatens to collapse this carefully curated reality. These individuals represent a fundamental breach in the system's logic, wielding capabilities that circumvent the established power hierarchies and forcing Public Security Section 9 to confront the structural failure of their environment. This tipping point exposes the inherent, inward-facing collapse of the status quo. As the system attempts to integrate the posthuman phenomenon into its existing economic model, it inadvertently reveals that its own weight is becoming unsustainable. The protagonist's mission is not to restore a lost golden age but to navigate a collapse that the system is attempting to monetize in real time. The film visually maps this power dynamic through its distinct use of CGI, which renders the world as a synthetic, frictionless environment where characters are frequently dwarfed by the massive digital infrastructures that dictate their movements. The cinematography emphasizes this isolation, framing the members of Section 9 against vast, sterile backdrops that signify their own obsolescence in an era of automated, algorithm-driven warfare. The visual language captures the loneliness of individuals who, despite their profound cybernetic enhancements, are effectively marginalized by the very systems they are tasked to uphold. The production design deliberately highlights the decay of the physical world, creating a visual disconnect between the high-fidelity digital representations of power and the tactile, rusted reality of the human condition. Ultimately, sustainable war serves as a reflection on the entrapment of the individual within a self-correcting, macro-scale feedback loop. The characters are defined by their resistance to a reality that views their agency as a variable to be neutralized. By focusing on the intersection of corporate hegemony and the breakdown of traditional political structures, the film posits that the modern human condition is defined by the struggle to remain an autonomous entity within a digital reality that has commodified conflict itself. The tension of the narrative arises from the realization that even the most rebellious acts are anticipated by the system's predictive engines, turning every confrontation into an inevitable movement toward an uncertain, yet structurally dictated, conclusion. The film insists that as the distinction between the organic and the synthetic dissolves, the primary moral conflict shifts from the preservation of individual life to the preservation of independent thought in a landscape where reality is governed by the relentless, sustainable demands of an indifferent, globalized machine. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as an intricate inquiry into the architecture of identity, specifically examining how the self survives when its foundational memories and social mandates are revealed to be structural fabrications. The film situates the consciousness of Major Motoko Kusanagi and the members of Section 9 not as autonomous agents, but as entities tethered to an evolving, often predatory, socio-economic narrative. The epistemic fracture occurs when the characters confront the reality that their service to the state is a byproduct of a cyclical, managed instability. As the narrative progresses, the characters experience the realization that their truth, that they are protectors of a fragile social order, is a deliberate construct designed to perpetuate a perpetual war economy. Their reaction is one of calculated detachment, where the shock of this revelation is internalized as a tactical requirement rather than an existential crisis. Discourse within the film serves as a primary indicator of the character's internal alienation. Motoko and Batu operate within a high-stakes, professional vernacular, yet their moments of profound silence reveal an inability to reconcile their tactical expertise with their increasing lack of purpose. When they do speak, their words often function as diagnostic reports on their own lives, maintaining a professional distance from the trauma they endure. They are rendered incapable of voicing the terror of their own commodification because their language itself is built upon the terminology of their function as government assets. This reliance on the jargon of security and surveillance acts as a linguistic cage, preventing them from articulating a self that exists outside of their operative parameters. The film pushes the boundaries of how characters process internal change, suggesting that they are effectively trapped by the restrictive syntax of their technological nature. They struggle to find the vocabulary to process their own history because that history is inextricably linked to the very networks they defend. This cognitive dissonance reaches a critical point during the sequences where Section 9 must engage in operations that directly serve the architects of their own oppression. They navigate this contradiction by retreating into a functional pragmatism, treating these moral compromises as necessary data points within an evolving mission. They justify their participation by reframing it as a search for the underlying logic of the enemy, effectively burying their discomfort under the guise of intellectual investigation. Ultimately, each protagonist clings to a fabricated ego, the meta-narrative that they are defined by their loyalty and their role as specialized peacekeepers. This identity acts as a psychological buffer against the encroaching realization that they are ultimately replaceable parts in a global machine. By sustaining the image of themselves as the good cop or the essential survivor, they prevent the total collapse of their psyche. The film argues that in a hyper-connected society, the self is merely a projection maintained by the repetitive performance of duty. The characters' struggle to claim autonomy is not found in the rejection of their digital augmentation, but in the internal process of recognizing the seams in their own programmed identities. Through this lens, the film presents the human element not as an immutable soul, but as an ongoing negotiation between raw experience and the persistent, artificial narratives that aim to dictate what it means to exist. Trauma and somatic experiencing. In Ghost in the Shell, SAC 2045, Sustainable War, the human experience is defined by the endurance of the psyche within a landscape of perpetual, low-intensity conflict. Major Motoko Kusanagi and the members of Section 9 navigate a reality where the trauma of total war has been abstracted into the sustainable war, a global economic engine that treats instability as a permanent utility. For these characters, the core wound is not a singular event but the loss of a coherent, static identity in a world that demands they be fluid, modular, and perpetually replaceable. The film preserves this trauma as a subtextual weight, delaying the full articulation of their existential exhaustion until the final acts, where the realization of their cyclical purpose forces a confrontation with the emptiness of their own agency. Somatic memory manifests in the film as a persistent, mechanical dissonance. Despite their heavily augmented forms, the characters exhibit physical markers of internal stress that bypass their digital interfaces. Kusanagi's movements, while precise and optimized for tactical superiority, carry the signature of a profound alienation. She interacts with her cybernetic frame as a utility rather than a vessel, treating her physical presence as modular hardware that can be discarded, repaired, or overclocked. This detachment from the flesh is the central coping mechanism for Section 9. By viewing the body as a programmable asset, they maintain a dissociative wall between their conscious minds, their ghosts, and the violent reality they are forced to inhabit. Their trauma is stored in the friction between their memories of humanity and the efficient, cold logic of their current technological existence. The film illustrates a cycle of repetition compulsion where the characters engage in the very conflicts that sustain their own entrapment. Their participation in the sustainable war is a defensive strategy. By acting as the primary actors in a controlled chaotic system, they exert a phantom sense of control over a world that has otherwise rendered them obsolete. This behavior creates a feedback loop of trauma, where every mission reinforces their role as instruments of a geopolitical machine. When the facade begins to crack, the characters are forced to reckon with the reality that their struggle is not a path to liberation, but a deliberate feature of the architecture surrounding them. The visual language of the film reinforces this internal state. The high contrast, synthetic lighting, and the stark, clean lines of their tactical environment serve to isolate the protagonists even when they are in constant communication with one another. The digital sheen of the world acts as a barrier, making the moments of vulnerability, where the human element briefly pierces the synthetic shell, feel fragile and fleeting. Kusanagi's reliance on tactical detachment is a form of avoidant self-preservation, a shield against the realization that their existence is sustained only by the continuity of the war itself. Ultimately, the film depicts the human element as a recursive process, one where the act of resisting the system is fundamentally linked to the system's own design, trapping the characters in a permanent state of unresolved, somatic tension. The shadow and the antagonist. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a complex exploration of the human psyche by placing Motoko Kusanagi and the members of Section 9 into a crucible where their internal identities are interrogated by their external adversaries. The film establishes the post-human existence not merely as a technological condition, but as a battlefield for the Jungian shadow. Kusanagi, as the quintessential operator, operates within a rigid framework of duty and tactical efficiency, yet her confrontation with the posthumans serves to surface the very trait she has long suppressed. The antagonists in this narrative are not chaotic agents of destruction, they represent the logical evolution of a species exhausted by the performative nature of corporate and state-mandated existence. Their pursuit of a new evolutionary tier acts as a mirror, reflecting the latent desire for agency that Kusanagi masks beneath her professional stoicism. The posthumans operate with a terrifying, coherent internal logic. From their perspective, the world has devolved into a perpetual cycle of sustainable warfare, an economic engine designed to keep human ambition in a state of controlled stagnation. By rejecting the boundaries of the current social reality, the antagonist adopts a radical stance that is, at its core, an existential attempt to escape the cycle of commodification. This worldview is entirely rational within their epistemological framework. If one identifies that the system is rigged to recycle human life as capital, the only logical action is to transcend that system entirely. This pursuit forces Kusanagi to confront her own role as a guardian of a status quo that offers no true liberation for the soul. Within this dynamic, the film utilizes the mirror character to provide a stark contrast to Kusanagi's development. Where the protagonist continues to navigate the architecture of the state, searching for meaning within the parameters of her mission, others in her proximity choose to abandon the illusion of stability when faced with the same systemic pressures. These figures act as a compass for the audience, highlighting the divergent paths one can take when the mask of the professional identity begins to crumble. The film moves beyond simple conflict by examining the parasitic and symbiotic nature of these relationships. Kusanagi's connection to her team is a delicate balance of reliance and burden. She feeds off their loyalty to sustain her own sense of purpose, while they derive their identity from her leadership. This codependency creates a closed loop of emotional capital, where the team's survival is contingent upon maintaining a shared, often unspoken, understanding of their place within the hierarchy. The projection of flaws becomes the central tension of the interpersonal drama. Kusanagi frequently views the erratic or emotional responses of her subordinates as liabilities, failing to recognize that these outbursts are reflections of her own suppressed humanity. By projecting her own insecurity regarding her status as a cyborg, her fear that her identity is merely a collection of data rather than a continuous consciousness, onto those she commands, she maintains a necessary distance. This detachment is her primary defense mechanism. When she confronts the antagonists, she is not merely fighting an external force, she is suppressing the part of herself that recognizes the validity of their revolt. The antagonists possess the freedom she denies herself, and her struggle is defined by the effort to reconcile her commitment to duty with the realization that the system she serves is the source of the very alienation she experiences. Consequently, the film presents the human element as a volatile intersection of memory, obligation, and the desperate, often subconscious, attempt to maintain a cohesive ego in a world designed to fragment it. The antagonist remains the ultimate testament to the volatility of the human spirit once it is stripped of its societal constraints, acting as a final, inescapable reminder of what Kusanagi sacrifices to remain within the fold of civilization. The visual proof of the psyche. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a deliberate exercise in the fragmentation of the self within a high-stakes, hyper-connected digital landscape. The film presents a reality where the human psyche is no longer a localized entity but a distributed process, susceptible to the recursive pressures of a globalized, permanent war economy. Through its distinct aesthetic choices and character trajectories, the film argues that the individual's identity is sustained only through the tension between their authentic interiority and the synthetic external mandates imposed upon them by the net. The visual language of the film serves as a primary tool for isolating the protagonist, Major Motoko Kusanagi, within a world that demands her constant performativity. The digital compositing often places Kusanagi against vast, cold, and meticulously rendered urban environments that dwarf her frame, underscoring her physical insignificance against the colossal infrastructure of the state and its military-industrial complexes. Within these wide, synthetic vistas, the lighting often shifts to a harsh, unnatural glow, trapping her in a state of clinical exposure that mirrors the surveillance-heavy nature of her existence. This visual isolation forces the viewer to confront the psychological toll of a character whose every action is recorded and whose very autonomy is mediated through layered interfaces. Kusanagi's character arc provides a profound exploration of the uncanny valley of the soul, where the line between humanity and programming blurs into a singular state of systematic efficiency. There are moments where her movements and tactical decision-making become so precise, so devoid of hesitation or error, that they appear programmed rather than felt. Yet, these instances of cold efficiency are frequently interrupted by subtle fractures, a hesitation in a look, a brief silence during a tactical briefing, that hint at the residual human ego beneath the cybernetic augmentation. These fractures serve as the film's way of identifying the ghost within the shell, demonstrating that even when the body behaves with the calculated reliability of a machine, the psyche remains a chaotic, unpredictable variable. Spatial psychology further reinforces this internal struggle as the characters navigate the rigid distinction between public and private spheres. In the bustling, performative spaces of the city, Kusanagi and her team adopt the personas required by their roles, moving through the environment with the practiced ease of professional soldiers. Their speech is clipped, utilitarian, and focused strictly on the mission. However, when the scene shifts to intimate, confined spaces, the facade momentarily thins. These settings reveal the vulnerability inherent in their situation, as the quiet moments between team members highlight the persistent, lingering trauma of their past experiences. The transition from public to private is never fully complete, however, as the persistent threat of surveillance ensures that even their most intimate discussions are perpetually haunted by the possibility of being overheard or recorded. Diegetic elements, particularly the audio environment, act as critical triggers for the characters' latent memories. The constant, ambient drone of digital networking, the sharp feedback loops of communication interfaces, and the precise mechanical whirring of equipment serve as reminders of the world that defines them. For a character like Kusanagi, these sounds are not merely background noise, they are the rhythmic reminders of her own technical construction. The film uses these sonic motifs to anchor the characters' present-day actions in the persistent trauma of their existence, suggesting that the digital architecture of their world is constantly encroaching upon their internal state. The breaking point for the psyche arrives when the external demands of the mission finally collide with the internal reality of the character's core identity. In the film's most intense visual moments, the digital facade collapses, leaving the character exposed in a way that strips away the protective layers of their tactical persona. The final imagery of the protagonist reflects this moment of absolute clarity, where the ego is no longer a construct of the system but a raw, unmediated presence. This visual dissolution signifies a reclamation of the self, suggesting that true autonomy is only found when the character chooses to discard the systemic expectations placed upon them. By focusing on these moments of rupture, the film posits that the struggle to maintain one's individuality in a simulated, data-saturated world is the ultimate human endeavor, proving that even within a shell of perfect code, the spirit remains a stubborn, defiant force. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a rigorous inquiry into the malleability of truth within a hyperconnected, posthuman infrastructure. In this reality, the epistemology of the individual is entirely contingent upon the digital architecture they inhabit. The film posits that objective truth has been superseded by a persistent stream of mediated data, effectively rendering the concept of a singular reality obsolete. The characters navigate a world where information is not merely a tool for observation but the primary medium for control, creating a state where the real is constantly reconstructed by the prevailing digital interface. The film operates on the premise that language, as a vehicle for internal thought and external communication, is functionally limited by the digital protocols that define the character's existence. As the narrative progresses, it becomes evident that the vocabulary available to Section 9 is restricted by the systemic biases of the surveillance apparatus they operate within. When the characters attempt to articulate the nature of their reality, they are constrained by the very technical frameworks designed to manage their cognition. The limits of their language define the limits of their world precisely because their cognitive processes are inextricably linked to cyber brain networks that filter and prioritize information, effectively narrowing the scope of what is perceivable. Truth in this environment is constructed through a collaborative, yet coerced, discourse. The film rejects the notion of an unmediated objective fact, instead presenting reality as a volatile construct maintained by consensus and administrative oversight. The post-truth state here is not a result of total chaos, but a deliberate optimization, the populace is submerged in a deluge of contradictory data points, which serves to insulate them from the underlying machinery of the state. Because the citizenry is occupied by the noise of constant, shifting narratives, they abandon the pursuit of an underlying objective reality in favor of a comfortable, albeit manufactured, stability. This systemic design ensures that truth functions as a service rather than a fundamental component of the environment. The epistemic authority in sustainable war is vested in the algorithmically governed systems that dictate the flow of the sustainable war itself. The state, intertwined with corporate and technical architectures, acts as the ultimate arbiter, determining which segments of information are verified and which are relegated to the status of error or noise. The characters, particularly the members of Section 9, operate in constant friction with this authority. Their struggle is not merely tactical, it is a fundamental challenge to the power structure's ability to define what constitutes real threat or real human behavior. The film demonstrates that when an authority holds the power to edit history and sensory input in real time, the internal state of the individual becomes the only site of resistance. Furthermore, the film deeply engages with the sensory illusion of the digital age. It echoes a modernized form of Cartesian doubt, wherein the characters must constantly question the veracity of their sensory experience. Because their reality is interfaced, the traditional reliance on physical intuition is replaced by a reliance on system integrity. The film asks how a consciousness can be certain of its existence when the senses are essentially peripheral devices connected to a central, potentially untrustworthy network. The visual representation of this doubt manifests in the way the film treats its environments, frequently blurring the boundary between the material, physical world and the digital layer that overlays it. This lack of clear demarcation forces both the audience and the characters to confront the possibility that their perception is merely a sophisticated simulation designed to facilitate specific behavioral outcomes. Ultimately, sustainable war asserts that in a world where data saturation is the norm, the only available anchor is the persistent, stubborn nature of consciousness itself. The film illustrates that the struggle for clarity is a continuous process of filtering through layers of engineered noise. By presenting a society that has optimized its own ignorance to maintain order, the film highlights the danger of accepting a mediated reality at face value. The ghost in the shell remains the only element that exists outside the direct control of the system's logic, serving as a reminder that even in a world defined by digital manipulation, the capacity for questioning the nature of one's own perception remains the most fundamental act of autonomy. The film does not offer a return to a pre-digital clarity, but rather an acceptance of the struggle for agency within an increasingly obscured, hyper-mediated landscape. Meta-narratives and social theory. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a rigorous investigation into the mechanics of a world governed by the sustainable war, a perpetual economic cycle that replaces traditional geopolitical conflict with a manufactured, global proxy system. This framework represents the final collapse of grand narratives. The Enlightenment ideals of progress and democratic stability have been discarded in favor of a closed-loop economic engine that necessitates constant, controlled crisis. By framing war as a service, a commodified necessity that sustains the financial health of nations, the film depicts a reality where the very concept of peace has been rendered obsolete by the logistical demands of capital. The citizenry resides within this hyperreal construct, where the screens of global markets and security alerts define the boundaries of existence, effectively replacing the messy, physical reality of sovereign nation-states with the frictionless, digital flow of transactional violence. The film's ruling structures operate through sophisticated ideological state apparatuses that function with algorithmic precision. In this environment, truth is not a consensus reached by human discourse but a curated output generated by predictive modeling. The society depicted is one in which historical precedent is actively edited and recontextualized to satisfy the requirements of the sustainable war model. The populace is kept in a state of managed cognitive ease, where their sense of safety is tied to the efficiency of the conflict, rather than its resolution. Education and mass media act as stabilizers, ensuring that the concept of a post-war future is treated as a systemic threat to global economic solvency, thereby internalizing the necessity of the conflict within the social consciousness of every individual. Within this architecture, rebellion is immediately absorbed and moneized by the system it aims to dismantle. Every act of defiance by Major Motoko Kusanagi and Section 9 is filtered through the logistical apparatus, serving to refine the predictive models of their adversaries. This reveals a chilling form of cybernetic control. The protagonists operate within a self-correcting feedback loop where their tactical successes are calculated inputs for the sustainable war's ongoing optimization. The film illustrates that when the system defines the parameters of opposition, every effort to exert agency becomes a component of the overarching structure. The characters are trapped in a cycle where their struggle is the very resource that prevents the system's collapse, turning their drive for justice into the fuel for the status quo. The philosophical weight of the film rests on this erosion of human agency in the face of hyper-capitalist optimization. The characters confront a reality where they are effectively cogs in an algorithmic machine, tasked with maintaining a balance that is inherently dehumanizing. While their individual technical and tactical choices remain sharp, the film posits that these choices are constrained by a reality that has already accounted for them. The narrative emphasizes that in a world where war is a service, the boundary between the protector and the product dissolves. By subjecting the protagonists to a system that processes their resistance as a functional necessity, the film presents a vision of existence where the individual's fight for meaning is consistently co-opted by the digital infrastructure of their society. This leaves the characters in a state of perpetual struggle, not against a singular, identifiable tyrant, but against a decentralized, pervasive logic that demands their participation in their own systemic enclosure. Ethics and the moral calculus. In the landscape of Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War, the moral calculus shifts away from traditional humanitarian imperatives toward a cold, systemic evaluation of existence. The film posits that ethics in a post-human era are no longer determined by the biological preservation of the individual, but by the maintenance of complex, network stability. Central to this is a sophisticated inversion of the classic trolley problem. The protagonists are not merely choosing between two paths of carnage, but are operating within a globalized sustainable war economy where the preservation of conflict itself becomes a logical necessity for social survival. The film argues that in a world governed by corporate state algorithms, the decision to intervene is itself an act of violence against the status quo, forcing the characters to navigate the tension between duty to their personal morality and the demands of a macro-scale systemic equilibrium. The film explores the morality of the non-human with rigorous detachment, establishing that personhood is decoupled from biological origins and reattached to the continuity of the ghost. By presenting sentient AI and cybernetic entities as capable of both profound altruism and cold-blooded calculation, the narrative suggests that the baseline requirement for rights is the ability to endure the existential weight of one's choices. The characters, particularly Motoko Kusanagi, function as agents who have moved beyond simple adherence to laws. Their moral rights are earned through the active, conscious reconciliation of their digital consciousness with the fragility of their physical shells. Personhood, in this reality, is defined by the capacity for self-determination in the face of pervasive, predictive data models that seek to automate human behavior. This struggle manifests as an active revolt against the nihilism inherent in a pre-programmed society. Rather than succumbing to the determinism of the sustainable war, a system designed to regulate human misery through perpetual, manageable conflict, Kusanagi and her team assert their agency through constant, unpredictable disruption. They embrace an absurd form of rebellion, recognizing that the system they fight is technically optimized for survival, yet fundamentally hollow. They choose to construct their own meaning within this vacuum, turning the act of resistance into a defining characteristic of their existence. The rebellion is not aimed at overturning the system to replace it with a utopia, but rather at asserting the validity of human-derived intent against the suffocating logic of the algorithm. The tension between the means and the ends becomes the ultimate ideological battlefield. The characters frequently align their tactical methods with those of their adversaries, utilizing the same surveillance tools, lethal force, and digital manipulation that define their enemy's power. The distinction, however, lies in the motivation behind the violence. The antagonists seek to enforce a rigid, singular vision of evolutionary progress, while the protagonists utilize violence as a tool to preserve the possibility of alternative futures. The ethical divide is found in the intent toward the collective. By refusing to accept the inevitability of the path set by their world's governing powers, the protagonists reclaim the moral high ground, asserting that the value of life is found in the struggle to protect the freedom of choice, even if the price is the destruction of the very infrastructure that sustains them. Ultimately, the film suggests that suffering with the truth is the only ethical posture available to those who wish to maintain their autonomy. That sustainable war is a comfort, a curated nightmare that allows the populace to believe they have a future within a stable framework. To see through this deception is to abandon the safety of the illusion, accepting the chaos of uncertainty as the price of reality. Kusanagi and her cohort embody this choice, viewing the comfort of ignorance as a form of intellectual death. By positioning the confrontation with reality as a perpetual obligation, the film insists that moral integrity requires the constant, active rejection of any system that demands the surrender of the individual ghost to the efficiency of the machine. The moral weight of their actions is anchored not in the victory over the enemy, but in the refusal to be assimilated by the machine's relentless, sustainable logic. Determinism, agency, and time. In Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War, the exploration of agency is not a debate over the existence of free will, but an investigation into how algorithmic environments manufacture the illusion of choice to ensure systemic stability. The film operates on the premise that human consciousness, even when augmented or digitized, remains bound by the structural imperatives of a society obsessed with perpetual, controlled conflict. The characters exist within a state of sustainable war, a socio-political architecture designed to prevent total collapse by ensuring that crisis is constant, predictable, and ultimately profitable. Here, agency is effectively transformed into a resource, managed by the very systems the characters believe they are navigating. The narrative posits that individual choice is a function of the predictive models governing the post-human landscape. Characters like Motoko Kusanagi operate with the belief that their tactical maneuvers possess independent weight, yet the film continuously reveals that their actions are anticipated, categorized, and integrated into the overarching data stream of the state. This is not a scenario where the individual is crushed by a faceless monolith, rather, the individual is permitted a range of motion that has already been accounted for in the system's long-term projections. Their autonomy is a byproduct of a feedback loop that rewards efficiency while preemptively neutralizing deviations. Consequently, the struggle of Section 9 represents an attempt to reclaim the capacity for genuine, unpredictable action within a reality defined by recursive probabilities. The film treats the burden of choice as an existential weight that forces characters to confront the limits of their own cognitive architecture. When the promise of digital immortality or total network integration is presented, it is framed as a liberation from the constraints of the physical body. However, the true terror of the film lies in the realization that such freedom leads only to an paralyzing awareness of the machine-like nature of human decision-making. If every thought can be digitized, archived, and simulated, the distinction between a spontaneous decision and a predetermined input vanishes. The characters are forced to act not because they possess a clear sense of moral direction, but because the act of resistance is the only way to verify their own existence against the backdrop of an indifferent, self-correcting algorithmic logic. The moral calculus of the film rests on the idea of temporal responsibility in an age where the future is treated as an objective variable. If the state utilizes predictive models to manage societal outcomes, the individual's present actions are weighed against their future consequences long before they manifest. This creates a form of temporal morality where characters are judged not by their intentions, but by their alignment with the system's projected trajectory. The conflict, therefore, is rooted in the refusal to accept this deterministic future. The characters fight to maintain their status as unpredictable variables, viewing the system's desire to stabilize time and causality as an existential threat to the human ghost. Ultimately, the film concludes by positioning the struggle itself as the definitive act of agency. By refusing to collapse into either nihilism or the comfort of systemic integration, the protagonists affirm the necessity of the struggle as the only authentic expression of the self. The final synthesis acknowledges that the system may continue to calculate, predict, and consume, but the act of defiance, the glitch in the machine, remains the singular territory the system cannot fully inhabit. The film suggests that while the structures of power are designed to render the individual obsolete, the persistent, irrational drive to exist beyond these parameters serves as the final, irreducible core of the human experience. The struggle is not a means to an end, but the foundational mechanism by which the character maintains their humanity against the encroaching silence of total systemic alignment. Through this, the film asserts that even in a world of manufactured realities and programmed outcomes, the decision to continue the resistance constitutes a genuine, sovereign claim over the self. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The visual architecture of Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045 Sustainable War functions as a deliberate exercise in digital surveillance, where the framing serves as a mirror to the omnipresent network monitoring the characters. The directors utilize a calculated visual hierarchy that emphasizes the displacement of human agency within a hyper-capitalist theater of war. By favoring low-angle perspectives during tactical engagements, the camera grants a sense of operational dominance to the units, yet these shots are frequently interrupted by rapid, mechanical pans that mimic the POV of automated drones. This creates a spatial language where power is never static or held by the individual, instead, it resides in the fluidity of the digital gaze. The characters operate within a visual field that assumes their movements are being logged, categorized, and commodified by the systemic infrastructure of the sustainable war. The camera movement functions as an objective, detached witness, eschewing the kinetic subjectivity of handheld cinematography in favor of smooth, frictionless dolly motions and precise crane sweeps. This stylistic choice mirrors the cold, calculated logic of Section 9's mission parameters. When the camera drifts through vast, empty urban environments, it reinforces the insignificance of the human element against the sprawling, procedural scale of the world's architecture. The movement feels distinctly robotic, suggesting that the eye behind the lens is itself an algorithmic participant in the conflict. This systematic approach to composition effectively strips the environment of warmth, rendering the physical world as a series of navigable coordinates rather than a lived-in space. Color palette architecture plays a critical role in distinguishing the disparate layers of reality the characters inhabit. The film utilizes a palette of sterile, high-frequency blues and desaturated grays to define the professional, militarized sectors, establishing a baseline of industrial efficiency. In contrast, the moments of introspection, specifically when the focus shifts to the internal state of the major, are marked by deliberate shifts toward warm, flickering amber tones and deep, shadowy recesses. This chromatic shift signals a movement away from the public, performative theater of the war and into the private, fragmented psyche of the post-human. The accent colors, typically clinical whites and pulsing digital neons, serve as persistent reminders of the networked environment, grounding the characters in a reality dictated by data streams rather than natural light. Depth and negative space are leveraged to emphasize the existential isolation inherent in a life mediated by technology. The compositions frequently trap characters against expansive, flat surfaces or within the deep, cavernous ruins of an aging cityscape, highlighting their vulnerability. By placing figures within vast, empty frames, the film evokes a sense of existential dread, suggesting that while the network is everywhere, the individual soul is increasingly untethered. The characters often appear as minute silhouettes against the oppressive scale of their environment, emphasizing that they are cogs in a larger, self-correcting machine. Light serves as the primary tool for manipulating the film's epistemic atmosphere. The lighting design favors a harsh, high-contrast chiaroscuro that emphasizes the mechanical surfaces of the characters' bodies and the synthetic nature of their surroundings. Rather than suggesting truth or clarity, this dark illumination acts as a veil. It flattens textures and obscures emotional depth, forcing the viewer to confront the uncanny artifice of the digital performance. When soft, diffused light does appear, it is confined to intimate, shielded spaces, underscoring the fragility of the human connections that persist amidst the artificiality of a war fought through screens and sensors. Every flicker of light is tied to the technical execution, serving as a reminder that in this world, even the illumination is a programmed construct. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. Ghost in the Shell, SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a digital crucible, where the aesthetic of the synthetic becomes the primary vehicle for exploring post-human existence. The film embraces a high-fidelity, full CG production model that deliberately sidesteps traditional animation norms to reflect a world defined by its own computational artifice. By prioritizing a stylized, cel-shaded rendering that emphasizes clean geometry and hard-edged silhouettes, the filmmakers establish a visual language where the boundary between the character and the digital architecture is intentionally porous. This choice creates an environment where Motoko Kusanagi and Section 9 exist as entities born of data, moving through a landscape that feels inherently manufactured, reinforcing the film's core inquiry into whether consciousness remains distinct when its vessel is entirely composed of vertices and polygons. The technical execution succeeds by anchoring its digital elements in a rigorous adherence to consistent physics. In the film's tactical sequences, the impact of heavy ordnance on cybernetic bodies or reinforced armor carries a perceptible weight, utilizing high-speed motion and kinetic debris to ground the action in a tactile reality. This weightiness prevents the characters from feeling like ethereal ghosts trapped in a machine. Rather, it asserts their presence as physical, albeit artificial, subjects within a rigid system. The lighting engines applied here contribute to this grounded feeling, with global illumination patterns that simulate ambient occlusion and bounce light with startling accuracy, ensuring that the characters appear integrated into their environment rather than merely floating as overlays. This integration is vital to maintaining the film's immersive authority, as it demands the viewer accept the digital construction as the definitive reality of the narrative. The film navigates the technical uncanny by leaning into the deliberate rigidity of its digital models. While human movement is often characterized by the subtle, unpredictable micro-tremors of organic biology, SAC 2045 utilizes a stylized, highly intentional movement set that mirrors the precise, calculated nature of its protagonists. By embracing this aesthetic, the film avoids the pitfalls of attempting photorealistic mimesis, which often leads to the unsettling failure of the uncanny valley. Instead, the characters possess a consistent, intentional artifice that feels coherent to the world they inhabit. When a character's eyes catch the light or their facial expressions shift, the lack of traditional human saccadic movement is reframed not as a technical flaw, but as a defining trait of their cybernetic condition. This stylistic consistency transforms the limitations of digital rendering into a deliberate artistic statement about the nature of the self in an age of total digitization. Furthermore, the film excels in the use of invisible VFX, where set extensions and digital cinematography create a sense of scale that would be impossible to achieve through physical staging. The sprawling, decaying urban landscapes of the post-scarcity world are rendered with intricate detail, turning the environment itself into a silent antagonist that towers over the individual. By utilizing wide-angle lens simulations, the camera establishes an objective, godlike perspective that emphasizes the insignificance of the individual against the massive, algorithmic currents of the geopolitical landscape. This digital architecture serves as a constant reminder that in a world where history and memory are managed by networks, the physical space one occupies is merely a secondary layer of information. The aesthetic of the film serves as the final synthesis of its philosophical ambitions. By utilizing an aesthetic that feels simultaneously expensive and hyper-curated, Sustainable War mirrors the very system it interrogates, a world where beauty and utility are products of efficient, high-end computation. The technical craft does not merely support the story, it acts as an extension of the film's thesis that we have already transitioned into a reality where the boundary between the natural and the artificial is obsolete. The final visual impact of the film is one of absolute technical control, asserting that in a future of total digital immersion, the only authentic truth remaining is the resilience of the ghost within the perfectly rendered machine. The film serves as a testament to the idea that as we move toward a fully digital existence, our understanding of humanity will be defined not by the organic, but by the elegance and precision of our own synthetic manifestations. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. The sonic landscape of Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a primary interface for the film's exploration of consciousness, blurring the distinction between environmental sound and the internal architecture of the characters. By integrating diegetic and non-diegetic elements, the film constructs a soundscape where the distinction between what is heard by the characters and what is felt by the audience evaporates. Electronic pulses, synthetic hums, and the sharp, rhythmic clicks of cybernetic movement are treated as musical motifs, effectively grounding the film's high-concept digital reality in a tactile, auditory presence. The score frequently bleeds into the ambient noise of urban environments, suggesting that the city itself is an extension of the protagonist's network, where the line between external data and internal thought is rendered porous and permeable. The sonic environment is characterized by a deliberate tension between industrial density and unnerving, synthetic clarity. The film utilizes a loud, overwhelming sound mix to emphasize the claustrophobic nature of its world, where constant information flow acts as an invisible, omnipresent layer of noise. When characters enter a state of deep digital immersion or psychological reflection, the mix undergoes a radical shift, prioritizing singular, resonant tones that mirror their internal focus. This transition serves to map the character's mental states onto the surrounding space, reflecting the isolation that occurs when an individual retreats from the physical world into the digital void. The sound mix actively tracks the character's perspective, muting background noise to amplify the significance of intimate, whispered revelations, effectively stripping away the digital noise to expose the vulnerability inherent in their post-human existence. Editing rhythm and visual pacing are intrinsically linked to this auditory manipulation. The film employs an erratic, pulsatile cutting speed that accelerates during moments of high-stakes conflict, mimicking the hyperstimulated, overclocked reality of its subjects. When the narrative approaches existential inquiry or moments of profound character crisis, the rhythm shifts to a slower, more deliberate cadence, allowing the silence of the void to act as a potent narrative device. Silence is wielded as a weapon, particularly during moments where the characters confront the limitations of their own programming or the falsity of their perceived reality. By cutting the sound entirely at critical junctures of philosophical revelation, the film forces the viewer to confront the stark absence of data, creating a sensory vacuum that heightens the gravity of the character's decisions. This technical execution demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how sensory information constructs an epistemic experience. The sound design does not merely accompany the visual spectacle, it dictates the audience's perception of weight, speed, and reality. The mechanical sounds of combat, the heavy impact of cyberlimbs and the digital whine of energy weapons are mixed with a tactile crispness that anchors the digital-heavy imagery in a simulated physics of profound weight. By manipulating the frequency and presence of sound, the film creates a consistent sensory logic where even the most abstract digital phenomena possess a palpable impact. Through this rigorous synthesis of rhythm and audio, Sustainable War asserts that the reality of its characters is defined not by biological presence, but by the precision and intensity of the digital data that constitutes their world, ultimately mirroring the very process of digitizing consciousness that the film explores. Synthesis of craft. The technical execution of Ghost in the Shell, SAC 2045, Sustainable War functions as a deliberate interrogation of the boundary between human agency and synthetic simulation. By utilizing a fully digital production pipeline, the film creates a visual environment where the medium itself serves as a narrative device. The reliance on 3D computer-generated imagery does not merely fulfill a functional requirement for action sequences, it manifests the existential condition of the characters who inhabit a world where their bodies are hardware and their memories are data. This stylistic choice creates a persistent sense of hyperrealism that mirrors the precarious status of the human soul within an increasingly digitized socio-economic structure. The cinematography employs a strategic use of focal length and spatial compression to emphasize the isolation of the protagonists. Long lenses are frequently deployed to flatten the depth of field, effectively trapping characters against their backgrounds. This compositional choice serves to reinforce the claustrophobia of their existence, suggesting that even in vast, sprawling urban settings, the characters remain hemmed in by the digital systems they navigate. The camera acts as a cold, objective observer, gliding through space with a precision that mimics the calculated nature of the world's pervasive algorithms. When the movement does become handheld or erratic, it signifies moments where the character's internal trauma pierces through the veneer of their programmed functions, grounding the viewer in the somatic reality of their struggle. Lighting design plays a pivotal role in externalizing the internal psychological states of the cast. The film utilizes a sophisticated application of chiaroscuro, where the sharp contrast between harsh, artificial light and deep, impenetrable shadow maps the Jungian shadow onto the environment itself. Darkness functions as a repository for the repressed histories and illicit data streams that define the characters' lives. As characters move from the illuminated, controlled corridors of corporate or state power into the dense shadows of the periphery, the lighting underscores the tension between their outward, performative roles and their private, often fractured, identities. This visual duality reinforces the film's central argument regarding the fluidity of the self, where the ghost is constantly negotiating with the limitations imposed by its environment. The texture of the medium is intentionally sanitized, eschewing the organic imperfections of traditional celluloid in favor of a clean, digital aesthetic. By embracing this high-fidelity, polished look, the film avoids the comfort of nostalgic grain, instead forcing the audience to confront the uncanniness of a world where the distinction between biological and digital reality has eroded. This choice elevates the technical execution into a philosophical statement. The film looks artificial because it depicts a reality that is fundamentally synthetic. The digital precision of the rendering serves as a technical metaphor for the society's obsession with order and data management, while the occasional deliberate glitches in movement or lighting evoke the inherent fragility of that control. The choreography of the frame often relies on extended, uncut sequences that prioritize spatial continuity over rapid-fire editing. This decision limits the ability of the viewer, and the characters, to escape the immediate consequences of their actions. When the camera remains tethered to a character through a protracted sequence of dialogue or combat, it emphasizes the lack of agency inherent in their situation. The viewer is forced to inhabit the same confined perspective as the protagonist, witnessing the exhaustion and cognitive dissonance that result from their struggle. This visual rigor confirms that the struggle itself is the defining characteristic of their existence, regardless of the ultimate success of their missions. Ultimately, the most technically impressive achievements in the film are those that link visual spectacle to philosophical revelation. The final sequences, which reveal the true architecture of the world's simulations, utilize expansive digital scales that dwarf the individual, visualizing the insignificance of the person against the systemic weight of the sustainable war. The integration of VFX is seamless because it exists to serve the film's inquiry into what remains of the human element when existence is reduced to information processing. By synthesizing craft with thematic intent, the film ensures that its visual language is an inseparable component of its intellectual work, leaving the viewer to grapple with a world where the boundary between the technical illusion and the authentic experience has been permanently erased. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Ghost in the Shell, SAC 2045, Sustainable War stands as a decisive evolution in the franchise, transforming the series' traditional focus on individual consciousness into a broader meditation on the automation of human conflict. By stripping away the singular, iconic mystery of the Major, the film forces the audience to confront a global landscape where war is no longer a political failure but a recurring financial instrument. This shift from existential inquiry to systematic observation creates a reality where the ghost, the spark of individual identity, functions as a residual anomaly within a hyper-efficient algorithmic engine. The film portrays a world that has institutionalized instability, turning the very act of survival into a commodity that the ruling classes trade with clinical detachment. The visual architecture of the film reinforces this thesis through its distinctive digital materiality. By utilizing 3D assets to render both the pristine, elevated environments of the elite and the rugged, modular spaces of the war-torn zones, the production design creates a seamless hierarchy of control. The characters move through these spaces with a sense of deliberate, kinetic precision, highlighting how their bodies, whether cybernetic shells or biological remnants, are subject to the same logistical management as the machines they operate. The decision to employ a high-fidelity, stylized CG aesthetic serves to alienate the viewer, mirroring the emotional distance the characters must maintain to function within a society governed by the logic of sustainable war. This is a world where human agency is buried under layers of procedural generation and bureaucratic oversight. At the center of this landscape, the psychology of Section 9 remains tethered to a haunting, collective trauma. The characters occupy a state of perpetual recovery, their identities defined by their history of service and the inevitable compromises required by their roles as state-sanctioned ghosts. Their interpersonal dynamics are characterized by a profound, professionalized silence, where intimacy is replaced by the efficiency of shared operational data. The film posits that in a society where reality is mediated through digital layers, the most profound expression of humanity is the persistent, albeit futile, attempt to maintain a connection to one's own memory. This is evident in the Major's navigation of the post-human landscape, as she struggles to reconcile her duty to a crumbling state with the preservation of her own autonomy. Philosophically, the film delves into the implications of a post-truth, algorithmic existence. It challenges the viewer to recognize the fragility of their own perceived agency in an era where data-driven narratives dictate social reality. By framing the conflict as a sustainable cycle, the narrative moves beyond simple heroism and into the realm of the absurd, where the protagonist's struggle is not to defeat a singular villain, but to endure the crushing weight of a systemic loop. The film's moral framework is defined by this grim pragmatism: there is no ultimate liberation, only the continuation of the cycle. This creates a powerful resonance with contemporary anxieties regarding the invisible power of algorithms, the decay of democratic discourse, and the realization that technological advancement does not inherently serve human progress. The technical execution of the film serves as the final, reinforcing layer of this argument. The use of dense, complex digital lighting and fluid, algorithmic camera movements mirrors the protagonist's constant state of surveillance. The sound design, alternating between the sterile, muffled tones of digital infrastructure and the visceral, jarring feedback of physical combat, underscores the tension between the synthetic and the biological. Every shot is constructed to minimize the presence of the individual, emphasizing that in this new world order, the human element is merely one variable among many. The film leaves the audience in a state of suspended finality, where the resolution of the immediate conflict does not equate to the resolution of the underlying systemic pressure. Ultimately, sustainable war serves as an unsettling mirror for the contemporary digital age. It captures the essence of a society that has commodified its own survival, where the pursuit of truth is sidelined by the pursuit of equilibrium. The film offers no easy answers, instead choosing to leave the viewer within the same loop that its characters inhabit. This choice is its most profound insight. The struggle to maintain oneself in an increasingly automated world is not a narrative that concludes, but a condition of existence. The legacy of this film lies in its unflinching portrayal of a reality where the human spirit is not the master of the machine, but a persistent, vibrating frequency within a massive, self-correcting system. It demands that the viewer confront the reality of their own participation in the very networks of data and conflict that define the protagonists, marking the film as a seminal work in the exploration of post-human endurance and the persistence of the individual in the face of inevitable, calculated collapse.